All right. Well, good morning. It is good to have you join us this morning. If you're joining us online, glad to have you be a part of this class. As people are just starting to fill in now, just to give a quick update for those of you who might just be joining us. My name is Lawrence Klingsheim, the pastor here at Northern Bible Church, and over the past several weeks we've been looking at the book I Will by Thom Rainer. The book is really about how we as Christians can be really intentional about being outwardly focused as opposed to inwardly focused, that we strive to be gospel-centered, mission-focused, not the opposite, which is where we as churches can sort of naturally go to, which is where we are slowly becoming inwardly focused, thinking about ourselves. And it's a natural thing that happens, but something that if we want to be focused on our mission, we'll avoid. So, just giving an introduction, but we'll start here. So, just to give a quick update, not so much update, but a recap of where we've been so far. We've been contrasting the idea of being inwardly focused and outwardly focused. An inward focus might look like this, that our wants and needs need to be met, that our preferences come first, and those in need of the gospel come to us. We'll contrast that, and then I'll give it a good example here. An outward focus that we seek to meet the needs of others, that our preferences are secondary, and we bring the gospel to those who need it. If I were to put an example here, I'd say that sometimes we tend to think of the church as more of a fortress, that it's a place we come to that's a safe space for us. We only let people in if we know who they are, what they're about, what their lives are, knowing that they're safe. When Scripture seems to describe the church as more of an embassy, that we go where the gospel's needed, that it's a launching point for people to bring the gospel to those in need. And that ends up being a much different focus. In an inward-focused church, the building is for us. In an outwardly focused church, the building is for gospel purposes. So if other people need to use it and it allows us gospel conversations, or it allows to build relationships that way, that's the goal. It might be that in an inwardly focused church, our service is primarily for the people that are here, for believers. In an outwardly focused church, the Sunday service might be more seeker-friendly. Now, there are really healthy ways to do that. There are some unhealthy ways to do that. So this is just sort of a broad brush that we're painting it with. And Rainer just sort of starts off this chapter in Acts chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. So when they had come together, they asked him, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" He said to them, "It is not for you to know times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." And Rainer spends some time focusing on the fact that these are Jesus' last words before ascending to heaven. And we tend to focus on the latter part of it, this idea that we're to be the witnesses to Judea, to Samaria, to the ends of the earth. And for him, he says, but do we pay enough attention to Jerusalem? Because if we look at those three, you get Jerusalem, which was the local ministry, the immediate context for people who had just seen what Jesus was doing, had seen him crucified. For some of those, had seen him risen again, although that was more likely in Galilee. You have Judea and Samaria, these outward places, not just to Israel, but to the other kingdom as well. And Samaria, those people that they had a good deal of issue with, and even to the ends of the earth. What we think of as global ministry. So starting in the immediate context, going into the greater context to a global context. So one of the questions we might ask here is, where do we tend to focus And we're going to get to that in just a minute. We might take a look for a moment at Romans chapter 10. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. This is one of those texts we love to use for missions. How then will they call on him in whom they've not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they've never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they're sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. So I'm going to give you a little question here, and I want to see how well we do. How many of us feel like, just focusing on Northern Bible Church for a moment, how many of you feel like you could name 5 of our global missionaries? Ward? Well, Ward, I expected you could. Ones that we support that are missionaries on a global scale. So we've got Hasbrooks, we've got Jim Frick, who's serving in Africa. Let's see, we've got, this is a challenge for me even. Rod Kastner, yep, so we've got 3. Ruth Dauber, sure, serving in Poland. Got that one. Do we have a 5th? That's okay. 4 is pretty good. What about regional missionaries? So missionaries that we support or know of that are serving on a regional scale. Mokaham is one, and included with that might be Paul Strobel. Frasers are good, yep. Yep, Bill Hoppy, yep, sure. What about local people who share the gospel with others? So just in the city of Bemidji. That's right, yep, we had the jail ministry. Mm-hmm. Frasers, yeah. Well, and see, here's the point. Mm. And that wasn't just to stretch your memory. It's because I think we tend to think of missions and the idea of sharing the gospel on more of a global perspective. That we love giving to global missions. We've got people in different countries who come with exciting stories, and sometimes we support missionaries that are over a region, but usually we can't think of too many people who are serving on a very local basis. Our neighbor just here to the north, Justin Hoover, is engaged in a number of evangelistic events, so we've got another one coming up here in Bemidji in not too much time at all. That's right, Ward. You serve at Camp Oak Hills. You're sharing the gospel with kids all the time, or with campers, or not campers, but counselors who need that encouragement as well. And our focus doesn't tend to be on the local church. And yet, I had a conversation with Fred Martin, who was the pastor of the Free Church here in Bemidji for 36 years, I think it was a pretty long run. And when I was looking at seminary, I had talked to him because I thought, maybe I'm being called to be a teacher. And he pulled me aside and he said, teaching is good. Like, I always thought I could teach as well. He's like, but I learned a lesson that I want to impart to you, and that's that God cares about and does his ministry through the local church. And so if God cares about the local church, maybe we should care about the local church too, which, of course, he did. He spent a lot of years in it. But if we think about how we do this work of ministry, I think if I look at just churches broadly, we tend to focus very much on global missions, on supporting global missions, but we don't tend to think about our local ministry in the same way we do global ministry. That there are people who need Jesus, that we want to send qualified people to meet that need, that we want to be engaging people, building gospel conversations, and seeing change happen. So, why do we entrust the work of ministry to others, and this is just broadly as churches, and neglect our own call to make disciples? Anyone want to try at that one? That's a pretty loaded question, admittedly. So if you don't want to, that's fine.
Perhaps it's comfort level kind of a thing.
Mm,
We are all called to different strengths in our gifts, and yet still we should all be evangelists and network where we share Christ with others.
mm.
But if I'm not the best speaker or the best presenter, or I myself being able to walk up and speak and do that, I'm more likely to help equip someone else to do that.
Well, and one of those interesting things is we talk about that passage in Ephesians where God gave shepherds, teachers, prophets, evangelists, apostles. He gave all these people. One of the interesting things in that list is it doesn't mention disciple makers, because part of the Great Commission is that we're all disciple makers. And you get people who are gifted in certain areas, but those giftings are there to equip the body for the work of ministry. Sure, Ward, go ahead.
As I was thinking through this in preparation for this meeting, there's, if you look at John 20:20, and in John 20:21,
Mm-hmm.
where Christ comes back into the upper room through the barred
Excuse me.
door to greet the disciples, that actually 2019, he starts with peace, be still.
Mm-hmm.
And then exhorts the disciples to take a look at his hands and his side to reveal that I really am the Christ.
Specifically thinking about Thomas, who wasn't buying it.
He wasn't there yet.
Okay, right.
The first one. And then 2021, if you're thinking about it insofar as 2021 is concerned, he says, again, start with peace, be still.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm sending you to make disciples is the gist of 2021.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take those two verses to heart, 2020 and 2021, it gives us a refreshingly new insight into these last two most difficult years as far as the church ministry is concerned.
Right, I think that's good. And we were just talking about John 20, 2019 through 2021. And I think it's interesting when we talk about the idea that these early disciples became apostles. Paul identifies himself as an apostle, which merely means one who's sent. Now, some people were sent, some people were not sent. There were a number of disciples that were sent out to do the work of ministry. Paul is probably the most well-known of the apostles, and yet the ancient church, I think, did they say it was it Thomas that's credited with going all the way to India, and a number of these others that had gone out, went as far as their feet or ships or whatever mode of transport they had could carry them. But of course, some people were put in place in order to see that those churches were growing. So Paul did not just start churches and keep going willy-nilly. You have Timothy, who was set up in Ephesus. You had others who served in different places, all to see the church nurtured and growing. We can keep moving here. Part of the question Rainer asks is simply, as he's come into churches, part of what he does is he consults with churches to see, are you growing? Are you really healthy? And so another book that he wrote that I had gone through with another church is called Autopsy of a Deceased Church. And it looks at 12 different factors and how that plays into church health in evaluating whether a church is doing as well as it thinks, or if maybe we haven't quite admitted some of the difficulties we're in. So he spends a little bit more time on some of those things. But part of it was asking whether, just from a numbers perspective, if our church is as effective as we think it is. And so one thing he talked about was in a particular community that the numbers grew by a certain amount and the church didn't reflect it. So I figured maybe it'd be fun for us to look at Bemidji. So Bemidji's population in 1990 was 11,245. 10 years later, we're at 11,917. So in those 10 years, the population in Bemidji grew by 6%, which is not an enormous number for a lot of churches. To grow by 5% in a church of 100 means you have 2 new people attending. Or in our case, maybe 2 more babies are born. So we've got a pretty natural growth curve that way. From 2000 to 2010, Bemidji grew by 13%, or from 11,917 to 13,431. So pretty interesting. Bemidji's population continues to go up, and these are year-round residents, not just BSU students who would throw this thing right off. Then you have 2019. This is an estimate because we haven't yet gotten through all of the 2020 census, so that gets to 15,434. So in those 10 years, the population grew by 15%, estimated. The numbers are not yet final. So Rainer defines healthy church growth at about 5%, or like we said, if we're at a church of 200 or a church of 100, we're looking at 2 people. Church of 200, it would be 4 people to be considered healthy, sustainable growth. And he mentioned a specific example in the first part of that book, in chapter 5, of how a church he was consulting with had gone from 450 people to 90 people, being very gradual without the church noticing that they were getting smaller. Maybe you have a few small Sundays, and then those small Sundays start to look a little big by comparison, and suddenly the church is struggling to figure out, how do we pay the bills? Now, is that where Northern is? No. We've been pretty consistently growing. We just had a membership class that had 13 people attend. So there's healthy growth there, but it asks a pretty interesting question. Is our church's growth consistent with the growth of the community? Or really the question that Rainer was talking about with that particular example of the church, are we growing by design or merely because Bemidji's growing? So do we have the mentality that if we have the doors open, people will come? Or is it we need to go and reach people with the gospel? And I'll stop and say that the point of this is not about church growth. And are our numbers checking out? Are we meeting quotas? That's not it. It's just when you come to asking about church and church health, the difficulty you run into is there's not a lot of tangible ways to measure the things that really matter. So you get to a church business meeting and you tend to measure what's attendance look like, what does giving look like, and what's the state of our building. There's not really a solid measurable metric for how are people growing spiritually. So I might be the only person who likes to read through church annual reports. Yeah, I probably am. I don't think even pastors like to do that. But the other question is, not only is our church's growth consistent with the growth of our community, should it be? You have all sorts of factors. Is your church in a spot where it's very visible? Is your church in a spot that draws a lot of people's attention? Like I used an example a previous week. I once had a guy in our church who thought we should put a big lighted marquee that talked about how some famous evangelist was going to be put on the screen that particular week. Because his view of church was, if we have attractive things, people will come. That people will come to a realization that they need the gospel and they'll come to us, as opposed to where the church started, which was being very intentional about bringing the gospel to others. So is this a launching point or a spot that we expect people to come? And Ward, you've got your hand raised. I wonder if you've ever heard this story about some early missions, which some of the early missions weren't working. And of course, maybe it's just an illustration. I don't know exactly. It's been a few years. But the idea was they realized that when you built walls and you built a compound and you expected that people would come in and sort of assimilate to the culture of the missionaries, it wasn't quite being as effective as the people who just went and were in the culture of those people they were serving. Is it, maybe
That's pretty consistent with
Mm-hmm.
They decided that, first of all, they were going to protect their compound by getting some Doberman pinschers, 2 Doberman pinschers,
Aha.
surrounding their little area there, their home area, with a brick wall that they put broken glass bottles on top of and concertina wire.
Mm-hmm.
And then they decided they still weren't safe in the country of Zimbabwe, so they went back to Germany, where the German church was actually paying for them to be missionaries in Zimbabwe.
Sure.
They took their yellow Mercedes Benz with brown leather diesel Mercedes Benz and towed it over to the YWAM base. And when I got to the YWAM base there in Harare,
Mm.
here's this Mercedes Benz sitting there unused,
Sure.
a layer of dust heavy over the top of it. And I asked him, I said, well, why is that car sitting out there doing that? Well, we can't get it running. Do you mind if I look at it? No, go ahead.
Sure.
So I went ahead and I just let the air out of it. The filters had been changed and never turned in tight, never primed, so that it sucked air into the cylinders,
Mm-hmm.
and it couldn't run. All I had to do was just leave the air out of there and hand pump it in, and it took off like a champ. And the guy told me, the YWAM director told me, I'm not really sure it's a good idea for us to have this car.
Mm.
And we're driving around here in Harare because, quite simply, YWAM is supposed to mean youth without any money.
Well, and so you bring up some good points that as we're talking about this, there are some things that are really obvious, some things that are not. And what we have to ask ourselves is really the hard question of being part of a church. That are we part of the kingdom which is devoted to bringing the gospel to people who need it, to building up disciples who train up disciples, or do we come on Sunday because it's a spot where we're comfortable, where we like the people, and generally it's a pleasing experience? Is this for us? Is it something we look forward to simply to meet our needs? Or is the Sunday gathering, the large gathering here, to be encouraging one another in the ministry that we're already doing throughout the week? And so Rainer simply asks some questions that, based on his observation of the church, the first question that we have to ask is, do we really believe that people need the gospel? And the example he gave was, if you saw somebody walking along a dry lake bed, would you run out there and save them from drowning? Well, no, because it doesn't seem like they're in any apparent urgent danger. And yet he says, if we really believe that Christ is the only hope of the world, that without Christ people are condemned for eternity, if we really believe that, won't that naturally lead to action on our behalf in terms of bringing the gospel to people who need it? Or do we feel like maybe the gospel doesn't need to be that urgent, or people don't really need to hear it because maybe they'll come around to it and they'll come to us. They know where we are, and if they know where we are, when they come around to the idea of Jesus, they'll come find us. We'll come back to that idea in a little bit. Do our actions reflect, this is the big part, our belief that people need the gospel? Now, one reason I didn't ask is I didn't think anyone would say no to the idea of whether we believe that people need the gospel. In fact, because so many people here have been involved in missions in one way or another, or at least have a close connection to it, I think you've got a pretty good idea of what it looks like for people to go. The same question is, do we feel an urgency to share the gospel with people? Or where that comes home, does our church have a culture of evangelism? Or even if we don't want to go that far, maybe we're not that outwardly focused, does our church have a culture of discipleship? of training up new believers, of even just caring for the people that are here. Because if we do, then that's good. That naturally translates to being outwardly focused. But if we lack in discipleship, are we ever going to be effective in evangelism, in sharing with people the good news, if we're not equipped or ready or feeling that urgency to also train them up in what it means to follow Christ? Yeah.
I answered the first question and realized the same answer was true for all of them. 2 words, not enough.
Not enough. Sure.
You really believe, not enough.
Mm. Well, and where some of that comes up is maybe we do believe, but we've got something that doesn't quite feel right about it. So Rainer mentions a few objections, and I've got a couple of my own that I added in. And I think you mentioned this one, that evangelism, sharing the gospel with other people, is not my spiritual gift. And it's true, there are some very gifted evangelists that they have a way of turning every conversation they have into something meaningful and spiritual, where I think for me, where I kind of ran into this was I was helping out a church in Detroit, and we were there on a youth mission trip, helping to do some work in an old building that they hope to use for community interaction and for a chance to build relationships with people. And so what they had us doing is going around these neighborhoods, just sharing about what the church was doing, giving out information. And I had one guy stop me and the other person that was helping with discipling some of these students, and he just squarely asked me, he's like, well, who is Jesus? And I, for a second, thought, oh, he's just messing with me. And then I looked at his face and I realized, no, he genuinely has no idea what we're talking about, which was a bizarre moment because you realize, oh, we're right in the Midwest, not really that far away from where we are. And here was a guy who genuinely didn't know who Jesus was. And so the two of us fumbled through just trying to present the gospel, realizing, like we'll talk about in the sermon later on, that the gospel sounds a little bit strange to the world we live in. And yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. 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 Ah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Well, and see, that's interesting for us because we have the idea in America that we functionally have an openness historically. Maybe there's less of this and increasingly less of this as we go on, but at least a familiarity with Christianity, because for a time, just attending church was something you did if you were a good person. Of course, that wasn't true of everyone, but there was at least a cultural familiarity with the gospel. A lot of people in the communities that I've served have grown up Lutheran, which means they've got a vague idea of who God is, but not a concrete idea of what that actually means in our lives. And it doesn't matter what small community you go to. There are Catholic churches, Baptist churches, Lutheran churches. Baptist feels like a new introduction to some of these small towns. I remember one I drove through. It's not far from here. Is it in, maybe it's Bagley or somewhere else. It cracks me up. It's the Grace Free Lutheran Church. I thought that was a funny name. Like, I guess there's no grace at that church. But all that going to the idea that there are people who, when you're around Christians all the time, when you engage with Christians often, when you run into somebody who has never heard the gospel or has never someone use the word God in a personal sense, it can throw you off because you realize We're well versed in Christianese, in all of these terms that we use to describe complex theological things, that when you need to explain it on a level to someone who's never heard it before, you hear the words coming out of your own mouth and realize it sounds foreign even to you. So it may be that we don't feel gifted in this particular area. I'm not a gifted evangelist. That's a valid objection, but is that an excuse that we use to then avoid all forms of sharing who we are, the hope that we have, or the faith that we have in Christ? Another objection is, well, that's what we pay our pastor or our staff to do. And you might say, well, that's crazy. But in all honesty, you think, well, I work a full-time job, and I've heard people use the question, like, well, what does the pastor do with his time? What sort of things is he engaged with? And those are good questions. And I've heard a number of people who are speaking to pastors and saying, you should be setting the example for your church in having relationships with non-believers. And it's, well, that's true. But I also don't want to feel like I'm the only one who's trying to reach people for Christ. Go ahead, Ward.
A local question that is relative to that very discussion right there.
Mm-hmm.
I was approached by a neighbor to Northern Bible Church here and informed that the parking lot here is a recording site for a video game.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So there are vehicles that pull in here early in the morning or all hours of the day and night. They're leaving here on a dead run,
Mm-hmm.
revving up the motors and spinning tires and everything else right here in the chapel or the church parking lot.
Yep.
And they said, do you think there's any way that we can get your pastor to help us shut that down?
Aha. That's true. We do have people that park in the church parking lot all the time. And because I live in the parsonage, which no longer has the old building blocking the direct view to here, there's always a question of, there are people who just turn around in that parking lot, which is fine. My kids get excited, kind of like dogs. Every time somebody drives in, they're like, who is it? Who's here? And they're like, I don't know the vehicle. They're just turning around. It's fine. Or, like you mentioned, we do get people who are playing Pokemon Go, and they pull in and they just sit there for half an hour, 45 minutes. Yeah, some people are like, we should shut that down. And I thought, well, we got people showing up to our parking lot. It shouldn't be that hard for us to just get them a few steps in the door if that's the route we're going. But we might also say, well, I don't want to impose my beliefs on others, which is where Rainer says, when we have an obligation to speak up, then it doesn't make any sense to stay silent, which is not to say that we shove the gospel down people's throats, that you're going to hear me and I'm going to speak, and if you don't listen, I'm just going to talk louder. I remember seeing a video of one pastor who was talking, he was shouting his rights at the police because they said you can't use a megaphone. And he's like, it's my constitutional right to be able to use a megaphone. I thought, no, it's your constitutional right to speak. If someone else was shouting across your yard at you with a megaphone, you'd probably have a problem with it too. Now, he was protesting an abortion clinic and shouting at people as they walked in. So you've got different tactics, but this idea that I don't want to impose my beliefs on others is sometimes valid, sometimes not. If we're saying, I don't just, this is a new relationship, I don't want to just say, you need to accept Christ, and if you don't accept Christ, and we walk through the doom and gloom part of Christianity. But at the same time, if people have known you for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and they have no idea that you have a faith, you might be holding back on something, especially when you've already done the work of building a relationship. They obviously care about you because they still want to talk to you. And I knew people who would build intentional relationships. There was someone who was a former missionary to I think he was in either Niger or Nigeria, and his children went to the other one. So it made me really confused. And what he did after he retired is every fall he would bake pies for all of his neighbors, just to simply say, I'm here and I care. And the amount of things that came out of that relationship. He built relationship. When somebody had a baby, the whole just neighborhood came together to throw them a baby shower. When somebody had a need, that whole group came together. So he wasn't just building relationships for himself, he was connecting other people. And I can tell you, there wasn't a single person there who didn't know where George stood. He was a gifted evangelist. That was his gift, though. And he wasn't worried about imposing his beliefs on others. He also made sure there was an established relationship before he did it. That's not to mention that he had, if I recall when I talked to him, about $500,000 worth of tracts in his basement. He ran a tract distributor ministry. That just meant there were more in that basement than I'd ever seen in any one spot before. Maybe another objection is I'm an introvert, that other people are gifted in leading into conversations, and I'm just not there. I'll tell you, well, if we get to we'll just jump to 6 here. I don't have anyone to go with me. I was just talking to our kids this week about Moses. It's like, I'm not a very good speaker. And he said, and so God said, fine, take your brother. Not always a good idea to have Aaron with in that case. Aaron was not so good on his own either. But you might say, I'm not gifted in those relationships, or I don't feel equipped to serve in that way, or I don't have anyone to go with me. None of these are bad on their own, but they're also not reasons to completely dismiss the Great Commission. So we might ask a question of how do we start going? How do we start reaching people with the hope that we have, or even just building relationships to share that hope? And I'd say start small. This is from Rainer. Pray for opportunities to share your faith with others, and know that if you do, opportunities are likely to come. So, one other thing you can do is invite people to church. And this was a statistic. He said in his 25 years of doing research, this was the one that stuck out to him the most. That 8 out of 10 people who did not attend a church said that they would attend if they were invited. That's 80% of people who are not connected. And now that doesn't specify whether they're simply not believers or if they are believers but don't attend. But that's a pretty significant statistic, that 8 out of 10 people who do not attend a church would come if someone invited them. That's not a hard thing to do. That's not true? Uh-huh. Sure. Okay. Well, and the previous church I was at, it was interesting. We came up with all kinds of ways to get people connected. And all of the people that came and stayed were people that had been in relationship with someone else. So it's always one of those questions. I said, well, what brought you here? And it's one of my favorite questions to ask, because sometimes it's a simple, well, I looked on the internet and yours was the only one that had Bible in it. So I came. Oh, that's fair enough. And you have other ones where it was, I've got a friend or someone that I work with who mentioned that they've been coming to church here, and we've been looking for a place to go to church, and so it was a sort of a natural connection that way. But they were invited, and they had someone to go with. I can't think of too many people, apart from my wife and I, because we get a kick out of seeing just how different churches have fellowship or do worship together, that when we're not here, sometimes we go other places. Or sometimes if we find out someone's got a Sunday evening service, we'll go attend there just to get an idea of what it looks like. And now, the difficult part is, I'm always curious, how clear is their vision and what they're doing? Are there people there to connect? And there are some churches we thought, wow, they are really friendly and really intentional about connecting with new people. There's also been churches where we've been absolutely smothered, and you realize we must have been wearing the wrong thing, or maybe somebody stuck a sign on our backs that said new people, talk to them, and it feels like you're there for 2 hours and everyone's paying attention to you. Those can be a little bit overwhelming, but they're interesting. It's not that we were going to attend here, but is there something about us that said, don't talk to me? I don't know. So there's a variety of experiences you get, and I guess this is on a survey. And what people say in a survey is always interesting, because there are probably some things that I would say about myself in a survey that may or may not be true. They just might be things that I would like to be true of me. And so some other things he says is invite people, well, okay, this one's me. Invite people to a group or invite people to serve with you. Because the whole point at the very end of this is, well, if we send missionaries, then the gospel will go forth. If our expectation is we pay someone to do this, or if we always feel like there's someone better equipped, or someone better called, or someone with better gifts, or someone, and we never ask what God might use us for, then sometimes we're content if the answer is God will use us for nothing. And maybe we wouldn't say that, but we don't have to be evangelists to pray for people. We don't have to be evangelists to tell people what church we go to and ask if they'd be willing to go with us one week. We don't have to be evangelists to tell people about the groups that we're in or the people we spend time with and invite them into those relationships. And the same is true of if we serve somewhere. It might be small. Maybe you clean at the church. Maybe you do things at someone's house. Maybe every so often you're asked to do projects for somebody, like you're rebuilding a deck or you're doing some roofing or whatever it might be. It's a small thing interested in coming along. I think that's more likely to do something than if you put together this big evangelistic campaign and you hire the right speakers and you hire the right musicians and you put together this big production. It might seem like you're doing a big thing because a lot of people in place, or you have those relationships in place where people are invited. Billy Graham famously wouldn't go and do a crusade unless he knew that pastors in that area were praying beforehand and were ready in case somebody came to Christ to walk with them through those next steps. Because simply sharing the gospel with people doesn't get them anywhere. Because if you're going to stumble and run into roadblocks with somebody, it can be someone who's trying to think through the same things. And the two of you help each other just get better.
That's the number one there too. Different times in the church's history, I'll take it in northern now.
Mm.
Particularly before COVID, because we had there were times that I wouldn't be one to go out into the community because I was so involved in the church.
Mm.
3 to 4 to 5 times a week I was doing things for the church.
Right.
It didn't give me time to go do other things.
Mm-hmm.
And we could get into that mindset where we're too busy working at
Sure.
church than to become the church.
Well, yeah, I think that's true, that we can get so wrapped up in doing things around the church that we neglect to be the church. I think, though, that different people will be called to serve in different areas. So you're going to get some people that are gifted administrators who are terrible evangelists. And I'd say in that case, serve the church in that way. Because being able to do that enables people to serve in a different capacity. I would not impose myself on someone else as a plumber, which, by the way, is one of those reasons I don't like those short-term mission trips where we go out there and say, well, we're gonna fix somebody's house. Because part of me thinks, well, none of us are qualified to do that. I feel like we're going to leave it worse off than when we got here. And sometimes you can serve in a good way. Other times you think, well, maybe that effort could be better spent elsewhere. So, yeah, I think it's true that for some of us that tendency is to find obvious ways that we can serve the church. Not all of those are bad. But busyness can be a real tricky thing sometimes too. Do we have the time to serve in different ways? Or, if we're already connected 3, 4, 5 times days a week with stuff that the church is doing, do we really have more time to give? And I'd say, let's focus on those people who aren't connected and maybe come once a week if they come. Or, there's lots of different ways we could lean in. I think the practical takeaway today is Are we serving like we think we're serving? Are we as intentional as we would like to believe we are? Or if when we take a step back and think about ourselves and the way we spend our time or those other sorts of things, if we think about that and come back convicted that I'm really not doing what I think I'm doing, or I'm not as effective as I think I am, or I'm not as intentional as I ought to be, then there are steps forward. It's just a matter of being uncomfortable and being okay with being uncomfortable. And as we go throughout the next few weeks, we'll keep going with some of those. There are a few more of those questions. I'm not sure if you guys got the notes coming in. I just stuck them on a chair at the back of the room. So if you didn't get those are there. We're going to pray and close this morning. If there are any of those questions, we've got all week to engage with those, or we've got the next chapter. We'll be looking at chapter 6 this next week. So let's close in a word of prayer. God, we thank you for today. And God, we thank you for the reminder that as your church, we're not called to complacency. We're not called to comfort. But God, as your gospel describes, if we're to imitate Christ, then we can expect suffering and death. Now, that seems like a raw deal, but what we get in exchange is so much greater than what we have here. That an eternity in your presence can't even begin to be compared to what uncomfortable things we might experience here. These things don't hold a candle to what eternity will hold. And so God, remind us as those of us who have children realize that they grow up far sooner than we feel like they should, because time doesn't stand still. That as we live, we realize that the years go by faster and faster every year, and there are people around us who don't know you, who haven't heard about you, who would be a part of something if they were simply asked. And so, God, would you give us a heart to share with others the hope that we have in you? Would you give us opportunities to care for people, to sacrifice to people, to show them that they are worthy of love? And God, would our small sacrifices give them a desire to learn about your ultimate sacrifice? Would you bless those conversations? Would you build those relationships? And would you help us to turn from being inward to outwardly focused believers who are not content to fight for our preferences, but God, only seek to make you known? Would you be honored and glorified in us this week? We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thank you.